I stepped off the research vessel onto the rocky shore, feeling the unfamiliar ground beneath my boots. The equipment dug into my shoulders, sample containers, collection tools, and my waterproof field journal all packed tightly into my backpack. The weight was familiar but uncomfortable after the 3-day journey at sea. The island stretched before us, newly emerged from the ocean depths, according to satellite imagery. Its sudden appearance had sparked immediate interest in the scientific community, leading to our hastily assembled expedition. Rocky outcroppings dominated the shoreline, giving way to sparse vegetation further inland. What struck me most wasn't what I saw, but what I didn't hear. The typical coastal cacophony of birds seemed strangely muted. Douglas Alvarez raised his hand, signaling for us to gather around a flat area where crew members were unloading equipment for our base camp. He stood with his back straight, his salt and pepper hair ruffled by the coastal breeze. The thin white scar across his left cheekbone caught the light as he turned to face us. "Let's get situated quickly," Douglas called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd led dozens of expeditions. "We need to establish camp before sundown." I watched him as the 8 of us formed a loose semicircle. Something about his manner seemed off, a tightness around his eyes, a subtle tension in his shoulders. Douglas Alvarez had a reputation for cool composure in the field, but today he seemed almost jittery, his gaze constantly shifting to the island's interior. "As you all know," Douglas continued once we'd gathered, "this island wasn't here 3 months ago. Our primary mission is to document everything: geological composition, plant colonization patterns, any animal life that's established itself, and potential archaeological significance." I studied the faces of my fellow researchers as Douglas spoke. Drew Hawkins, our geologist, nodded along, his thick eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Next to him stood Isabella Meyer, our botanist, already eyeing the sparse vegetation visible beyond our landing site, her curly black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Rowan Watson, tall and broad-shouldered with his clean-shaven head, stood slightly apart from the others, his archaeological tools already organized in the pouches of his belt. The youngest of our group, Alvin Williams, could barely contain his excitement. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, his bright green eyes darting between Douglas and the island beyond, clearly eager to begin exploring. "Jaden," Douglas said, turning to me, "your expertise in marine ecosystems will be crucial. We need to understand how marine life is adapting to this new landmass." I nodded, mentally cataloging the sampling locations I'd need to prioritize. As a marine researcher, newly formed islands represented rare opportunities to study ecological succession from its earliest stages. Douglas continued assigning responsibilities to each team member, but my attention kept drifting to our surroundings. Something felt wrong. The island looked normal enough on the surface. Volcanic rock, patches of pioneering vegetation, a few visible insect species. But an inexplicable sense of wrongness prickled at the back of my neck. While Douglas spoke, I scanned the landscape more carefully. There were signs of wildlife, tracks in the softer soil patches, disturbed vegetation, even distant movement. But the island felt unnaturally quiet. Even the waves hitting the shore seemed somehow muffled, as if sound itself was being absorbed. "We'll split into pairs tomorrow," Douglas was saying, pulling my attention back. "Today, we establish camp and prepare our equipment. Safety protocols are standard but strict. No one goes anywhere alone, hourly radio check-ins, and everyone back at base camp before dark." As the team dispersed to set up tents and organize gear, I approached the water's edge, kneeling to collect my first samples. The water clarity was unusual, exceptionally clear but with an odd bluish tint I hadn't seen before. I labeled the sample containers carefully, making detailed notes in my field journal. "Pretty wild, huh?" Alvin appeared beside me, his enthusiasm infectious despite my unease. "An entirely new ecosystem to document. We might discover species that evolved in isolation before the island surfaced. Maybe, I replied, capping another sample vial, though the timeline seems too short for significant evolutionary adaptations. Alvin shrugged. You never know what we might find. That's why we're here, right? As daylight began to fade, our camp took shape. 6 tents, arranged in a circle around a central area, with research equipment and a small fire pit. The team gathered to share a simple meal as darkness fell completely. The conversation mostly focused on plans for tomorrow's exploration. I contributed to the discussion, suggesting coastal survey patterns and marine sampling locations, but part of my attention remained fixed on our surroundings. The darkness beyond our camp seemed unusually thick, almost tangible. The fire's light didn't penetrate as far as it should have. When the team began retiring to their tents, I volunteered for the first watch. Sitting alone by the dying fire, I strained my ears against the silence. That's when I heard it. A sound from the darkness that made the hair on my arms stand up. Not quite a call or a cry, more like a rhythmic clicking followed by something that resembled whispering, but wasn't quite human. I reached for my flashlight, pointing it toward the sound source, but the beam seemed to dissipate before reaching whatever made the noise. The clicking stopped immediately, replaced by silence even more profound than before. I waited, perfectly still, listening intently. Minutes later, the sound came again, this time from a different direction. The clicking pattern was similar but not identical, as if responding to the first. This wasn't any wildlife I recognized from my years of field research, and judging by the island's recent emergence, these couldn't be endemic species with established communication patterns. The sounds continued intermittently through my watch, always from the darkness beyond the reach of our lights, always stopping when I directed my flashlight toward them. I made detailed notes, trying to transcribe the patterns, but found it difficult to capture their alien quality. Whatever was out there watching us, it wasn't anything I'd encountered before. I woke with a start, the clicking sounds from my night watch still echoing in my head. Sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, casting everything in a muted orange glow. I reached for my field journal, wanting to review my notes from the previous night before they faded from memory. A commotion outside pulled my attention away, voices raised in concern, footsteps hurrying past my tent. I quickly pulled on my boots and unzipped the tent flap. "Has anyone seen Alvin this morning?" Isabella was asking, her normally composed face pinched with worry. I glanced toward Alvin's tent. The flap was open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Something felt wrong immediately. I walked over and peered inside. Alvin's sleeping bag was empty, clearly slept in but abandoned. His backpack lay tipped on its side, contents spilled across the tent floor, sample containers, collection tools, his camera. Everything was there except Alvin himself. "His tent's empty," I called out to the others. "Looks like he left in a hurry." Dr. Grant emerged from his tent, immediately taking charge of the situation. His face betrayed no emotion as he surveyed the scene. "When was the last time anyone saw him?" he asked, his voice clipped and professional. Drew scratched at his stubbled chin. "He was here when I turned in last night, around midnight." "I heard movement during my watch," I added, "but I assumed it was just someone using the latrine." Grant nodded once, then made a decision. "We need to organize search parties. This island isn't large. He has to be somewhere." Within minutes, Grant had divided us into 3 groups. I was paired with Drew to search the rocky coastline to the east. Isabella and Rowan would check the interior, while Grant and the 2 research assistants would cover the western shore. "Radio check-ins every 30 minutes, Grant instructed, handing out the devices. "If you find anything at all, call it in immediately." Drew and I headed out, following the shoreline where jagged volcanic rock met the unusually clear water. The morning sun beat down on us as we called Alvin's name, our voices carried away by the wind. "You think he went out collecting samples in the dark?" Drew asked, after we'd been searching for almost an hour. Maybe, I said, though it didn't make sense. Alvin was enthusiastic, but he'd agreed to the buddy system like everyone else. It's not like him to break protocol. Drew stopped suddenly, pointing toward a small tidal pool nestled among the rocks. Look there. Floating in the shallow water was a familiar waterproof notebook. Alvin's. I carefully retrieved it, water dripping from its sodden cover. When I opened it, my heart sank. The pages were blank, the ink completely washed away by seawater. Whatever observations Alvin had recorded were gone. "We need to tell Grant," Drew said, taking out his radio. Grant arrived at our location within 20 minutes, his face grim as he examined the water-damaged notebook. He turned it over in his hands, as if hoping to find some clue we'd missed. "This is all you found?" he asked, looking up at the surrounding rocks. "Nothing else," I confirmed. "No footprints, no equipment, just the notebook." Grant tucked the ruined journal into his pocket and surveyed the coastline. "We'll continue searching until sundown, but..." He paused, looking out at the endless expanse of ocean. "It's likely he went out during the night to collect samples and slipped on these rocks. The current here is strong." The clinical way he described what must have been Alvin's death sent a chill through me. Drew seemed to share my discomfort, his thick eyebrows drawing together. "Shouldn't we wait for rescue?" Drew asked. "Call in a proper search team?" Grant shook his head. "Our next scheduled contact with the research vessel isn't for 3 days. We have limited satellite phone battery that we need to conserve for emergencies." "This isn't an emergency?" I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. Grant's eyes hardened. "We have no evidence of foul play, and we've already conducted a thorough search. The most likely explanation is that Williams fell into the ocean during an ill-advised solo excursion." "Alvin," I corrected. "His name is Alvin." Grant ignored this. "We'll continue with our research schedule. The best thing we can do now is complete our mission." He turned to leave, then added almost as an afterthought, "Document everything carefully." Williams would have wanted the work to continue. After Grant left, Drew placed a hand on my shoulder. "Something's not right about this," he murmured, glancing back to make sure Grant was out of earshot. "I know," I agreed. Alvin was careful, enthusiastic, yes, but not reckless. Drew looked like he wanted to say more, but instead sighed heavily. "Let's finish searching this area, at least." We spent another 2 hours combing the coastline but found nothing else belonging to Alvin. Eventually, we returned to camp where the mood was somber. Isabella had been crying, her eyes red-rimmed as she mechanically sorted plant samples. Rowan sat nearby, cleaning his tools with unusual intensity. Grant called a brief meeting, informing everyone that the search had yielded no results beyond the recovered notebook. He reiterated his theory about Alvin falling into the ocean and emphasized that our research must continue. "We'll note Williams' contribution in all published papers," he concluded, as if that settled everything. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went through the motions of collecting marine samples, documenting water clarity, temperature, and the unusual blue tint I'd noticed earlier. My mind wasn't on my work, though. Every few minutes, I found myself scanning the shoreline, hoping to see Alvin walking back to camp with that enthusiastic grin of his, ready to share some amazing discovery. As the afternoon wore on, I worked my way along a stretch of sandy beach near the camp. The sand here was dark, volcanic in origin, making it easier to spot anomalies. That's when I noticed them, tracks pressed into the damp sand near the water's edge. I crouched down for a closer look. They weren't human footprints, that was certain. They resembled paw prints, but unlike any animal I could identify. Too large for most mammals that could swim to an island, yet the pattern was all wrong for sea turtles or other reptiles. The impressions were roughly circular with what appeared to be 5-digit-like extensions, almost star-shaped. I followed the tracks, noting how they emerged from the water. continued up the beach for about 15 yards, then returned to the ocean. Whatever made them had come from the sea, moved around briefly on land, then returned to the water. I quickly took out my camera to document the tracks before the tide could erase them. After taking several photos from different angles, I placed my field journal next to one print for scale and took more pictures. "Grant," I called out, spotting him further down the beach. "You need to see this." He approached with obvious reluctance. By the time he reached me, the incoming tide had already begun washing away the clearest prints. "What am I looking at, Medina?" he asked. "Tracks," I said, pointing to the fading impressions. "Look at the pattern. Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Grant squinted at the sand. "I see some disturbed sand that could be from crabs, birds, or wave action." "These aren't from crabs or birds," I insisted. "Look at the size, the pattern. 5 points, like fingers or claws." Grant straightened up, giving me a look that bordered on patronizing. "I understand you're upset about Williams, but seeing mysteries where there are none won't help the situation." "I'm not making this up," I said, frustration building. "I took photos." "Good," Grant replied. "Include them in your report. But right now, I need everyone focused on their assigned tasks, not chasing shadows." He walked away, leaving me staring at the nearly vanished tracks. By the time I thought to call Drew or Isabella over to verify what I'd seen, the tide had completely washed away the evidence. That night, after a quiet dinner where Alvin's absence hung heavy in the air, I sat outside my tent reviewing the photos I'd taken. The tracks were clearly visible in the images, validating what I'd seen despite Grant's dismissal. I made detailed notes in my journal, sketching the prints and recording their measurements based on the scale reference. The camp grew quiet as everyone retreated to their tents. I should have been tired after the day's events, but sleep felt impossible. Instead, I sat just outside my tent, staring toward the shoreline, barely visible in the moonlight. That's when I heard it, faint but unmistakable. "Help! Anyone there?" I jumped to my feet, heart pounding. It was Alvin's voice, I was certain of it, coming from somewhere near the shore. "Alvin?" I called out, grabbing my flashlight. No response came. I moved toward the beach, sweeping my light across the darkness. "Alvin! Where are you?" I reached the shoreline, my flashlight beam cutting through the night but revealing nothing but rocks and gentle waves. The voice had seemed so clear, so close. "Alvin!" I tried once more, desperation creeping into my voice. Only silence answered me. I stood there for what felt like hours, flashlight trained on the dark water, seeing nothing but the reflection of my own light. Whatever, or whoever, had called out was gone, leaving me alone with the empty darkness staring back at me. I stood at the shoreline for a long time, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, straining to hear Alvin's voice again. Nothing. Just the gentle lap of waves against the volcanic sand. Eventually, I trudged back to camp, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Sleep evaded me that night. When dawn finally broke, I was already up, organizing my collection gear. I needed to focus on something tangible, something I understood. Marine life had always made sense to me in ways people sometimes didn't. I spent the morning collecting specimens along the eastern coastline, working methodically to document the island's aquatic ecosystem. The water's unusual blue tint had caught my attention from day one, but what I pulled from those waters today made my skin crawl. The first fish I netted looked wrong immediately. It was a reef-dwelling species common to this region, but it had 3 small, perfectly formed fins protruding from its head like a grotesque crown. I photographed it from multiple angles before placing it in a preservation container. This wasn't natural variation. This was something else entirely. As I continued my collection, each specimen revealed new horrors. A crab scuttled across the shallows with one massive, overdeveloped claw that dwarfed its body, while its other pincer remained stunted and vestigial. The asymmetry was so severe it struggled to move properly. "What the hell happened to you?" I murmured, carefully transferring it to a separate container. In a protected tide pool, I discovered a colony of sea anemones, unlike any I'd documented in 15 years of research. When my shadow fell across them, they emitted a pulsing blue-green light in synchronized patterns, unmistakable bioluminescence. I checked and rechecked my identification guides. Nothing matched. These weren't just unusual adaptations. These were mutations that shouldn't be possible, especially not on an island that had only existed for 3 months. Evolutionary changes like these should take generations, not weeks. By midday, I had filled 6 specimen containers with increasingly disturbing samples. Each one defied conventional marine biology. Some had extra appendages, others displayed tissue structures that seemed to serve no functional purpose. A small octopus had 9 tentacles instead of 8, with the 9th growing directly from its mantle. I needed to share these findings with the team. Back at camp, I found Drew examining rock samples, while Isabella sorted through plant cuttings. Rowan was nowhere to be seen, and Grant sat alone at the communication table, writing in his journal. "I need everyone to see this," I said, setting my collection containers on the main table. "Something's very wrong with the marine life here." Drew looked up first, setting aside his magnifying glass. "What did you find?" I opened the containers one by one, explaining each abnormality as the team gathered around. Isabella gasped when I showed her the bioluminescent anemones. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "These kinds of mutations don't just happen spontaneously across multiple species." Grant pushed forward, his eyes widening as he examined each specimen. He picked up the container with the 9-tentacled octopus, studying it with unusual intensity. "Fascinating," he said, his voice oddly flat. "Truly remarkable adaptations." "These aren't adaptations," I corrected him. "These are mutations, harmful ones in most cases. That crab can barely function with that oversized claw." Grant didn't respond. Instead, he took out his camera and began photographing each specimen in detail. I noticed he was using his personal camera, not the expedition's equipment. "Shouldn't we be documenting this for the official record?" I asked. Of course," Grant said without looking up. "I'm just taking some preliminary shots for my notes. We'll do proper documentation later." But later, when I checked the expedition's shared digital archive, I found no mention of my specimens. Grant had kept his notes and photographs separate, stored in a personal journal he carried everywhere. That evening, Drew tried to make our scheduled check-in with the research vessel. I was sitting nearby, updating my field journal, when I heard him curse. "Damn it, not again." I looked up to see him tapping the communication console. The screen flickered with static, lines of interference cutting across the display. "What's wrong?" I asked, moving closer. "Equipment's acting up. Can't get a clear signal." He adjusted several settings, but the static only worsened until the screen went completely dark. "That's the 3rd time today. Something's interfering with our comms." "Could be the island's volcanic composition," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Modern equipment was designed to function in far more hostile environments. Drew shook his head. "Not like this. This isn't normal interference. We were cut off. Again." The realization settled like a weight in my stomach. I woke before dawn to the sound of Isabella's voice, sharp with alarm. Stumbling from my tent, I found her standing by the generator, flashlight beam illuminating the damage. "Look at this," she said when she saw me. "Something tore through the housing." I crouched beside her, examining the generator. Deep gouges cut through the metal casing, exposing wires and components beneath. The cuts were clean and precise, not the random damage of falling debris or weather. "These look like—" I didn't finish the sentence. They looked like claw marks, but that was impossible. The gouges were too deep, too strong to have been made by any animal I knew. "What could do this?" Isabella whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know." By the time everyone was awake, tension hung over the camp like a storm cloud. Grant examined the generator damage with surprising calmness, almost disinterest. "We have the backup," he said simply. "We'll use that until we can repair this one." "That's not the point," Drew argued. "Something did this, and we need to figure out what." "Animals are curious about human equipment," Grant replied dismissively. "A bird, perhaps, or some rodent species we haven't documented yet." "No bird or rodent could cut through metal like that," I said. Grant just shrugged and walked away, ending the conversation. Later that morning, Isabella's scream brought us all running to the research tent. She stood among her carefully organized plant specimens, hands shaking. "They're gone," she said. "All my samples from yesterday. They were right here, sealed in these containers." The containers sat open, empty except for a thick yellowish residue that coated the inside surfaces. The smell was overwhelming, like rotting vegetation and something else I couldn't identify. "What is that?" Drew asked, covering his nose with his shirt. Isabella shook her head. "I don't know. It wasn't there when I sealed them." I dipped a sample swab into the residue for analysis, but before I could cap it, Grant appeared beside me and took it from my hand. "I'll handle this," he said. "We need to maintain proper protocols with unknown substances." Something in his tone made me uneasy. It wasn't concern for safety. It was possessiveness. The days that followed saw our team fracture further. Small disagreements escalated into heated arguments. When Rowan accused Drew of moving his tools, they nearly came to blows before Isabella stepped between them. "This isn't like us," she said that night as we sat together by the fire. The others had retreated to their tents early. "We've all worked together before. We don't fight like this." "It's the isolation," I suggested, though I wasn't convinced. "And Alvin's disappearance has everyone on edge." She nodded, but her eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond our camp. "I feel like we're being watched, all the time." I couldn't tell her she was wrong. I felt it too. Grant's behavior became increasingly erratic. He disappeared for hours at a time, offering vague explanations about perimeter checks or additional sampling. He'd return with dirt-covered clothes and scratches on his hands, his normally meticulous appearance disheveled. One afternoon, I spotted him returning from the island's interior, an area we hadn't yet properly surveyed as a team. His pants were caked with mud to the knees, and a dark stain spread across the front of his shirt. "Find anything interesting?" I asked casually, trying to mask my suspicion. He startled at my voice, then composed himself quickly. "Just preliminary observations. Nothing significant." But his eyes told a different story. They had a strange gleam to them, an intensity I'd never seen before, excitement mixed with something that looked unsettlingly like reverence. "We should organize a proper exploration of that area," I suggested. "The whole team together." "Not necessary yet," he replied too quickly. "I'm still assessing safety considerations." That night, I lay awake in my tent, listening to the now familiar clicking sounds from the darkness. They seemed closer than before, more insistent. Grant's voice drifted from somewhere outside, not speaking into a radio or to another team member, but murmuring in a low, rhythmic pattern that mimicked the clicks. I knew then that whatever was happening on this island, Grant wasn't just aware of it, he was part of it. I was pushing my beans around my plate, appetite gone after everything that had happened in the last day. The clicking sounds from the night before kept replaying in my head, along with Grant's voice mimicking them. The camp felt different now, tense, with everyone keeping to themselves. Drew caught my eye from across the fire and tilted his head slightly, motioning me to follow him. He stood up, mumbled something about checking his samples, and walked toward the edge of camp. I waited a minute before making my own excuse. Going to organize my notes, I said to no one in particular, though Isabella nodded absently. I found Drew standing by a large volcanic boulder just beyond the circle of tents, his face half hidden in shadow. "We need to talk about Grant," he said as soon as I approached, his voice low. "There's something you should know." "What is it?" I asked, glancing back toward camp. Drew ran a hand through his hair. I didn't want to say anything before because I wasn't completely sure, but after what happened with Alvin and all the equipment failures, I recognized him, not right away, but eventually. Recognized him from where? From research papers, old ones, classified stuff that got leaked years ago. Drew looked around nervously. Grant wasn't always Grant. He worked under a different name in the 80s, for a Cold War bioweapon program. My stomach dropped. What kind of bioweapon program? The worst kind. They were trying to create organisms that could rapidly adapt to any environment, spread quickly, and change things. Living things. Drew's eyes met mine. The project went bad. Really bad. There was an accident at their research facility. 14 people died. "Jesus," I whispered. "You're sure it's him?" Drew nodded. The photos matched when I looked them up on the satellite phone before the communications went down. He changed his name, but it's him, and that's not all. He's been trying to recreate elements of that experiment ever since. Moving from university to private research lab to field station. Never staying anywhere long. Always working on something just adjacent to his official research. "Out of guilt?" I asked. "Partly, but I think it's more like obsession." Drew lowered his voice even further. He believes he almost cracked something big back then, something beyond weapons. The accident happened right when they were on the verge of a breakthrough. I felt cold despite the warm evening. "So, what are you saying? That this expedition isn't about documenting a new island at all?" "I'm saying he picked this team very specifically. Look at our specialties: marine biology, botany, geology, archaeology. We're not just documenting, we're helping him find something." Drew's expression was grim. "The mutations you found today? They're not random. This island is showing exactly the kinds of biological adaptations his old research was trying to create." I thought about Grant's reaction to my specimens, how he'd kept the photos and notes separate from our shared records. We need to tell the others. "Not yet," Drew said quickly. "We need more proof. Grant has powerful connections. How do you think he got funding for this expedition so quickly? If we start making accusations without evidence. So what do? Keep watching. Document everything separately, and be careful." Drew squeezed my shoulder. "Don't go anywhere alone with him." When we returned to camp, the others had already retreated to their tents. I sat by the dying fire, trying to process what Drew had told me. The island, Alvin's disappearance, the mutations, the equipment failures. It all took on a sinister new meaning. I waited until morning light began to filter through the trees before approaching Grant's tent. He was already awake, organizing papers at the small folding table outside. "Dr. Grant," I said, deciding on directness, "I need to ask you something." He looked up, his face neutral. "Of course." "I've heard some concerning information about your background, about your work during the Cold War." His expression didn't change, but his hands went still. "Oh?" "Biological warfare research. An experiment that killed 14 people. Is that true?" Grant set down his pen very deliberately. "Where did you hear this? Does it matter? Is it true?" "My past work has no relevance to our current research," he said, his voice suddenly tight. "I've been involved in many classified projects over the decades. Some were unfortunate in their outcomes. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." His tone turned cold. "We're here to document a scientific phenomenon, not discuss ancient history. The mutations I found yesterday are fascinating examples of rapid adaptation," he cut in. "Nothing more." "Then why keep separate notes? Why not share your observations with the team?" Grant stood up, towering over me. "I suggest you focus on your assigned tasks, Medina. The island has enough mysteries without inventing conspiracies." He walked away, ending the conversation, but I noticed his hands were shaking. Over the next several hours, I watched Grant closely. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. He disappeared for nearly 3 hours in the afternoon, claiming he was checking the western perimeter, but returned from the opposite direction, his pants covered in dark mud up to the knees. When Isabella asked about his findings, he smiled strangely and said, "This island has special properties, hidden potential most people wouldn't understand." "What kind of potential?" I pressed. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity, the kind that changes everything we know about evolution, about adaptation, about life itself. Later, as we gathered supplies for the evening meal, Grant approached me by the equipment cases. "You should be more careful with your questions, Medina," he said quietly. "Some knowledge isn't meant for everyone." "Is that what happened at your old research facility?" I asked. "Someone learned something they shouldn't have?" His face hardened. "That was different. We weren't ready then. The environment wasn't right." "And it is here?" He looked past me toward the island's interior, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "This place is special, perfect even. You've seen it yourself in your specimens." I couldn't sleep that night. The clicking sounds seemed to surround our camp, no longer just coming from the darkness beyond, but moving between the tents. Around midnight, I heard Grant's voice from his tent, not the mumbling from the previous night, but actual conversation. "Yes, the progress is remarkable," I heard him say clearly. "Better than we could have hoped." I sat up, straining to hear. Was he using a radio? All our communications equipment had failed. "The specimens confirm it," Grant continued. "The changes are happening faster than projected. We should proceed to the next phase." I crept from my tent, staying low. Grant's tent flap was closed, the dim glow of his lantern visible through the fabric. I moved closer, careful to stay silent. "They don't understand yet," Grant said, "but they will. Medina's already asking questions." There was a pause, as if he was listening to someone respond, but I was certain everyone else was in their tents. I could see Isabella's silhouette in hers, and Drew had been snoring when I left. "No, containment won't be a problem," Grant said. "When the time comes, they'll either adapt or they won't." I backed away slowly, heart pounding. Grant was speaking to someone, or something, and whatever they were discussing, it had nothing to do with scientific documentation. Isabella's screams tore through the night. Not cries of surprise or fear. These were raw, primal sounds of terror that made my skin crawl. "Help! Something's—" Her words cut off in another scream. I sprinted toward her tent, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the ground. The entire camp seemed to wake at once. I heard rustling from other tents, confused shouts. When I reached Isabella's tent, I froze. The fabric was moving, rippling, and tearing as if caught in a violent windstorm. Except there was no wind. Long gashes appeared in the material, opening like mouths as the canvas shredded itself in midair. Isabella burst through what remained of the entrance, her face contorted in terror, arms flailing as she tried to escape whatever was attacking her. For a split second, I thought she'd made it. Then her body lifted off the ground. "Isabella!" I lunged forward, but stopped as she rose higher, suspended by nothing I could see. She hung there, 3 feet off the ground, her limbs thrashing against invisible restraints. Her eyes found mine, wide with confusion and fear. Then she was flung sideways with impossible force, her body crashing against the volcanic rocks at the edge of our camp. The sound of impact made me gag. She tried to push herself up, but then, God, I'll never forget this. Long, deep cuts began opening across her arms, her legs, her face. Blood welled from wounds that appeared from nowhere, as if carved by invisible knives or claws. Isabella's screams became weaker as more gashes opened across her body. Her white t-shirt turned red. She reached toward me, mouth moving, but no sound came out. Then she went still, her eyes fixed on nothing. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. More screams broke my paralysis, different voices from other parts of the camp. I turned and ran toward the main area, shouting for the others. "Drew, Rowan, something's attacking us." The camp had descended into chaos. Equipment cases were being flung open, their contents scattered and crushed by unseen forces. Our specimen containers shattered one by one, samples spilling across the ground. The backup generator sparked and smoked as deep gouges appeared in its metal casing. I spotted a figure lying motionless near the shore. Rowan. I ran to him, dropping to my knees beside his body. His chest and throat were torn open, the same mysterious slashes that had killed Isabella marking his body. His archaeological tools lay scattered around him, some bent and broken. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the volcanic sand. Through my shock, I noticed something. A pattern. Every time someone turned on a flashlight, the invisible thing seemed to converge on the light. The camp lantern flickered and then exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. The backup generator, which had been running, was now a mangled wreck. They were targeting our technology, our lights, our noise. "Jaden!" Drew's voice cut through the chaos. He grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "The radio! We need to call for help!" We ran toward the communications tent, ducking as equipment flew through the air around us. Drew was breathing hard, his face pale in the moonlight. The satellite phone. Grant kept it in his personal gear. Drew gasped as we ran. "If we can—" His words stopped abruptly as his feet left the ground. One moment he was beside me, the next he was suspended in the air, arms and legs kicking against nothing. "Drew!" I reached for him, but he was already being lifted higher. His eyes met mine, filled with the same terrible realization I'd seen in Isabella's. Then his body convulsed as invisible forces tore into him. Blood sprayed across my face, warm and wet, as wounds opened across Drew's chest and throat. His arms were wrenched at impossible angles. Something ripped through his abdomen, spilling his insides into the air. I stumbled backward, wiping Drew's blood from my eyes, unable to look away as his body was systematically torn apart by creatures I couldn't see. His screams stopped, suddenly replaced by wet, gurgling sounds. Then silence. What remained of him dropped to the ground in a broken heap. I stood there, covered in my friend's blood, as more screams echoed across the camp. The invisible attackers were everywhere, destroying everything, killing everyone, and I couldn't see them. I couldn't fight them. I couldn't stop them. It hit me that I couldn't hear anyone else anymore. No more screams, no more calls for help, just the continuing sounds of destruction as the invisible entities moved through what remained of our camp. "Medina!" I spun around to see Grant emerging from the darkness, his face splattered with blood, clothes torn at the shoulders. His eyes were wide but focused in a way that seemed almost inappropriate given the horror surrounding us. "We need to move now," he said, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "They're targeting anything that moves or makes noise. We have minutes at most." "What about the others?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Grant's expression didn't change. "There are no others. Just us now." He pulled me toward the eastern edge of camp. "The cave system. It's our only chance for survival." "Cave system? What are you—" A nearby equipment case exploded, sending metal fragments flying past my head. Grant yanked me forward and we started running. "I found it yesterday," Grant explained between breaths as we sprinted across the volcanic sand. "The entrance is hidden behind those rock formations. The creatures don't go inside. Don't ask questions. Just move." I followed him across the beach toward a cluster of black volcanic rocks. Behind us, I heard the wet, slicing sounds growing closer. Grant ducked behind the largest rock formation and disappeared from view. I followed, finding a narrow opening in the rock face that had been completely invisible from the beach. Grant was already crawling inside. I hesitated for a second, looking back at the destroyed camp. The invisible entities were still there, still tearing apart anything left standing. I had no choice. I dropped to my knees and followed Grant into the darkness. The passage was tight, scraping my shoulders as I crawled forward. The beam of Grant's flashlight bounced ahead, revealing a tunnel that seemed to wind downward. The sounds of destruction from outside grew fainter as we pushed deeper into the earth. "Keep moving," Grant called back. "Don't slow down." The tunnel gradually widened until we could stand, though I had to hunch to avoid hitting my head on the low ceiling. The air felt damp and cool against my skin, smelling of minerals and something else I couldn't identify, something almost organic. We continued for what felt like an hour, navigating through winding passages that branched in multiple directions. Grant moved with purpose, never hesitating at intersections, as if he knew exactly where he was going. "How do you know this route?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "I told you I found it yesterday," Grant said without turning around. "Now be quiet and keep moving." The tunnel began to slope more steeply downward. I had to brace myself against the walls to keep from sliding. The rock felt smooth and slightly slick under my fingers. We turned a corner and Grant stopped so suddenly I almost ran into him. "We're here," he whispered. The tunnel opened into something much larger. I stepped forward beside Grant and felt my breath catch in my throat. We stood at the edge of an enormous underground cavern, so vast that the beam of Grant's flashlight couldn't reach the far wall. But we didn't need the flashlight to see. The entire cavern glowed with an eerie blue-green light that pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves. The light came from what looked like crystals, thousands of them, growing from the floor, walls, and ceiling of the cavern. They ranged in size from tiny clusters no bigger than my thumb to massive formations taller than a person. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grant didn't answer. He stepped further into the cavern, and I followed. As we moved away from the tunnel entrance, I noticed something moving in the air around us. At first, I thought it was dust or moisture catching the light, but then I saw them clearly. Floating through the air were translucent jellyfish-like creatures. Their bodies were nearly invisible except when they passed in front of the glowing crystals, creating shifting shadows that revealed their forms. They moved with purpose, drifting through the cavern in what almost looked like patterns. "These are them," I said, understanding dawning. "These are what killed everyone." Grant nodded, watching the creatures with an expression that looked disturbingly like admiration. "Yes, beautiful, aren't they? Almost perfectly adapted to their environment. Nearly invisible in normal conditions, but here..." He gestured around the cavern. "You knew about these things," I said, anger rising in my chest. "You knew before we ever came to this island." Grant turned to me, his face illuminated by the pulsing blue-green light. "Not exactly. I knew something might be here, but I didn't know what form it would take. This is beyond what I imagined possible." "What are you talking about?" Grant walked toward one of the larger crystal formations, careful not to disturb the floating creatures. "Remember what Drew told you about my work during the Cold War?" I nodded, staying where I was. "The bioweapon program. The accident." "It wasn't just any bioweapon program," Grant said, running his fingers along the surface of a crystal. "We were working on creating organisms that could adapt rapidly to any environment. organisms that could be introduced to an area and quickly transform everything within it. The pieces started falling into place. The mutations in the marine life, the plant samples. Yes, all signs that something survived, something evolved. Grant turned back to me. You see, this island isn't new, Medina. It's very old. It was just hidden, submerged. What? This island was the site of our original experiment, Grant said, his voice taking on a lecturer's tone. We exposed various marine organisms to experimental radiation designed to accelerate evolution. We thought we could create the perfect biological weapon, something that could adapt to any defense, something that could remain undetected until it was too late. One of the jellyfish-like creatures drifted close to my face. I could see through its translucent body to the complex structures inside, nothing like any jellyfish I'd ever studied. The accident, I said. The 14 people who died. Grant nodded. We lost control. The organisms adapted faster than we anticipated, became something we couldn't contain. The government's solution was to sink the entire island, to bury our mistake under hundreds of feet of water. But now it's back. Yes, Grant said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. After all these years, tectonic activity has brought it back to the surface, and they've continued to evolve, to adapt. These creatures are direct descendants of our original experiments. They've survived for decades in isolation, becoming something magnificent. I looked around at the pulsing crystals, at the nearly invisible predators floating through the air, and felt sick. You knew. You put together this expedition knowing what might be here. You got everyone killed because you wanted to see your experiment. Grant's face changed, the awe in his expression hardening into something else. Determination mixed with guilt. No, not to see it, he said, his voice low and strained. To end it. I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words, while the jellyfish-like creatures continued their hypnotic dance through the cavern air. I brought this team here because I needed specialists who could help me understand what these things had become, Grant continued. I needed to know how they'd evolved, what weaknesses they might have developed. Everyone from the original experiment died except for me. He turned away, his shoulders hunched as he moved toward a large equipment pack I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a cluster of smaller crystals. My entire career since that day has been about one thing: undoing the damage I helped create. His hands trembled slightly as he unzipped the pack. Every research position, every paper I published, every grant I secured, it was all to gain the knowledge and resources I needed to come back here and finish this. From the pack, Grant pulled out what looked like blocks of clay with wires embedded in them. I recognized them immediately. Explosive charges, military grade. You brought bombs to a scientific expedition? I backed away, my boot heels scraping against the crystal-studded floor. I brought what was necessary. Grant began placing the charges at structural points around the cavern, working with practiced efficiency. The plan is simple. We collapse this entire cavern system, seal these things underground permanently where they can never reach the mainland. The implications hit me all at once. But we need to get out of here first. Grant paused, his back to me as he set another charge. When he turned, his expression was resigned but resolute. Someone has to ensure the charges detonate properly. The timing has to be exact, the placement precise. He finished wiring a detonator. If we don't do this right, they'll find another way out. I shook my head. There has to be another way. We can call in the military, quarantine the island, like they did last time. Grant's laugh was bitter. They sank an island, Medina, and look what happened. Nature found a way to bring it back. These things survived underwater for decades. Do you really think a quarantine will stop them? One of the floating creatures drifted closer to us. its nearly transparent form becoming visible only as it passed between us and a large crystal formation. I could make out what looked like tendrils trailing from its body, the same kind that had torn through my colleagues. "We don't have much time," Grant said, moving to the final position and placing the last charge. "They're becoming aware of us." I watched as he connected the final wire to what looked like a timer device. His fingers moved with practiced precision despite their slight tremor. "How long?" I asked. 10 minutes. Enough time for you to get a head start." He activated the timer with a series of button presses, then straightened up and pointed to a narrow opening in the far wall of the cavern. "That tunnel leads to a surface exit on the eastern shore. I mapped it yesterday. Follow it straight out, no turns." "What about you?" "I need to stay and make sure nothing interferes with the detonation." He walked over and grabbed my shoulders, turning me toward the exit tunnel. "Now go, run." I felt his hands push against my back, urging me forward. But I hesitated. Despite everything, the lies, the deaths, the manipulation, I couldn't just leave him. "Grant, this is my mess, Medina. My responsibility." His voice had softened slightly. "I brought those people here. Isabella, Rowan, Drew, Alvin, their deaths are on me. Let me do this one right thing." I looked back at him, standing amid the glowing crystals, the timer counting down in his hand. Around us, I noticed more of the creatures had begun to drift in our direction, their movements no longer seeming random but purposeful. They were floating toward us with increasing speed, their nearly invisible forms distorting the blue-green light as they approached. I crawled through the collapsing tunnel as explosions shook the underground cavern behind me. Each detonation sent tremors through the rock, making loose stones rain down all around. Come on, I muttered, digging my fingers into the rough stone floor to pull myself forward faster. Rock debris struck my back and legs with increasing frequency. Something heavy hit my shoulder, sending a spike of pain down my arm. I couldn't stop. The air grew thick with dust that coated my throat and made each breath a struggle. I felt the tunnel ceiling cracking above my head as I desperately pushed forward toward daylight. A thin sliver of light appeared ahead, growing wider as I scrambled toward it. The tunnel was starting to give way completely. Almost there, I gasped, my voice barely audible over the rumbling. A massive crack split the rock above me. I lunged forward, throwing myself through the narrow opening just as the tunnel collapsed behind me. Daylight blinded me momentarily as I tumbled onto volcanic sand, rolling away from the cave entrance as rocks continued to fall. I pushed myself up on shaking arms and turned to look back. The entire central portion of the island was collapsing into a massive sinkhole right before my eyes. The ground buckled and folded inward with a deafening roar. Trees tilted and disappeared as the earth swallowed them whole. When the rumbling finally stopped, I was left staring at a massive depression where the center of the island had been. The destruction was complete. Nothing could have survived that. I turned away from the devastation and looked out to sea. Relief washed over me when I spotted the research vessel still anchored offshore. They hadn't left yet. There was still a chance. My radio was gone, lost somewhere in the tunnels. I needed to signal them somehow. I patted my pockets, searching for anything useful, and felt something hard in my jacket. The emergency flares. Grant had given them to me days ago when we first landed. My hands shook as I pulled out the red cylinder and removed the cap. I aimed it skyward and pulled the trigger. The flare shot up with a whistling sound, bursting into brilliant red light high above me. I fired a second one for good measure, watching as it arced over the water. Minutes passed as I waited on the shore, wondering if they'd seen me. Then I spotted movement, a small boat launching from the vessel's side. They were coming. When the ship's crew retrieved me, I collapsed into the bottom of the rescue boat. The sailors peppered me with questions, their faces showing confusion and horror. What happened? Where are the others? The boat captain asked, scanning the devastated island behind me. I was the sole survivor of the expedition. The weight of that truth pressed down on me as heavily as the tunnel ceiling had moments before. "Geological collapse," I said, my voice hollow. The whole center of the island gave way. Everyone else was caught in it. I told the official investigators the same story once we reached the main vessel. A catastrophic geological event. Unstable volcanic formations. No one could have predicted it. I described how we'd been separated, how I'd barely escaped while the others were caught in the collapse. I omitted any mention of the invisible creatures or Grant's true mission. No mention of the floating predators that had torn my colleagues apart. Nothing about Cold War experiments or bioweapons or creatures that had evolved in isolation for decades. I knew that no one would believe my actual account of events. They'd think I was traumatized, delusional, or worse, they'd think I was somehow responsible. The investigation team documented my statement, took photographs of my injuries, and provided medical attention for the cuts and bruises covering my body. They seemed to accept my explanation. Islands formed by volcanic activity could be unstable. Sinkholes and collapses weren't unheard of. It was a tragedy, but a natural one. 3 days later, we were heading back to the mainland. I stood at the ship's railing as the engines rumbled beneath my feet. As the ship sailed away, I looked back at the ruined island, now smaller on the horizon with each passing minute. I wondered if the nightmare was truly over, or if some of the creatures might have escaped the collapse. They had survived underwater for decades after all. What if they adapted again? What if they found a way out through some underwater tunnel? What if they were already spreading to nearby shores? I stepped off the research vessel a month ago, but the island never really left me. The nightmares started the first night back in my apartment. Visions of floating predators, invisible claws tearing through flesh, and Grant's face illuminated by pulsing blue-green crystals as the cavern collapsed around him. At first, I told myself it would pass. Trauma takes time to process. That's what the departmental counselor said during my mandatory debriefing session after I'd given my sanitized account of a geological disaster that had claimed the lives of my colleagues. I'd nodded and promised to call if the nightmares persisted. I never made that call. How could I explain what really happened? That invisible creatures had torn my colleagues apart while I watched. That the island was home to the evolved descendants of Cold War bioweapons. That I'd helped cover it all up. So I tried to move forward. I unpacked my surviving equipment, filed my falsified report, and attended the memorial services for Isabella, Rowan, Drew, and Alvin. I stood stoically as their families wept, the weight of my lies crushing me as surely as the tons of rock that had buried Grant in that cavern. Then the strange incidents began. The first time, I convinced myself I was mistaken. I'd left my keys on the kitchen counter before going to bed, but found them on my coffee table the next morning. A simple memory lapse, I reasoned. Stress affects recall. But then my field journal moved from my desk to my bathroom sink. A coffee mug I'd placed in the dishwasher appeared on my nightstand. My laptop shifted from one side of the couch to the other while I showered. Each incident left me more unsettled than the last. I started taking photos of where I placed things, creating evidence of their original positions before they moved. I was sitting at my desk reviewing these photos when I heard it. The same clicking sound that had surrounded our camp on that first night. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs as the clicking continued from somewhere behind my bookshelf. I told myself it was pipes, old building, water pressure, anything but what I knew it was. But the clicking returned night after night, sometimes from the bathroom, sometimes from the closet, sometimes from directly above my bed. I'd lie awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening as the clicks formed patterns, communication between entities I couldn't see. One night I grabbed my phone and recorded the sounds. The next morning the recording contained only static, I stopped sleeping. I installed motion-activated cameras that captured nothing while items continued to relocate around my apartment. I lined salt along my windowsills, hung garlic over my door. Desperate measures born of desperation, not science. None of it worked. 2 weeks after returning home, I watched from my bed as my desk chair rotated a full 180 degrees with no one in it. The next day, I found my shower running at full blast when I returned from buying groceries. The day after that, all my kitchen cabinets stood open when I woke up, though I'd closed them before going to bed. The truth became impossible to deny. Something had followed me home from the island. I examined every item I'd brought back: my clothes, my backpack, my sample containers. I found nothing unusual, but the incidents continued. Whatever had attached itself to me wasn't physical, at least not in any way I could detect. I started losing weight. Dark circles formed under my eyes. Colleagues commented on my appearance, suggesting I take more time off. I nodded and smiled and lied about insomnia while the clicking sounds grew louder each night. 3 weeks after my return, I woke to find words scratched into the condensation on my bathroom mirror: adapt or die. That was when I finally admitted I needed help. Christina Rice's office was on the 5th floor of a modern building downtown. Her website described her as specializing in trauma recovery, particularly for survivors of natural disasters and accidents. Close enough, I supposed. Our first session was mostly biographical. I told her about my academic background, my research interests, my role on the expedition. I recounted the official version of events: unstable volcanic formation, sudden collapse, tragic loss of colleagues. I described my symptoms: insomnia, anxiety, hypervigilance. I said nothing about the moving objects, the clicking sounds, or the message on my mirror. During our second session, Christina gently probed deeper. You mentioned feeling responsible for your colleagues' deaths. Can you tell me more about that? I stared at my hands. I was the one who suggested we explore the eastern side of the island that morning. If we'd gone west instead, maybe they'd still be alive. A lie wrapped in truth, the best kind of deception. Survivor's guilt is common, she said, but geological events aren't predictable or preventable. You couldn't have known. I nodded, swallowing the truth that burned in my throat. By our third session, the incidents in my apartment had escalated. I'd found my refrigerator door standing open. Food spilled across the floor. My shower curtain had been torn down. My books had been rearranged in alphabetical order by first word rather than by author or title. I sat in Christina's waiting room debating whether to tell her everything. Would she believe me? Would she report me to the authorities for withholding information about the deaths? Would she simply diagnose me with psychosis and prescribe medication that wouldn't help? Jaden? Christina stood in her office doorway, professional in a gray blazer over a white blouse. Come in. I followed her into the warm, neutral space with its comfortable chairs and strategically placed tissues. She settled across from me, clipboard in hand. How have you been since our last session? I took a deep breath. Not good. Can you elaborate? I haven't been entirely honest with you. The words felt like gravel in my mouth. About what happened on the island. Christina's expression remained neutral, but she leaned forward slightly. I'm listening. The official report. I stopped, reconsidering. If I told her everything, would the creatures target her too? Was I putting her in danger? But if I didn't get help, I might never break free from whatever connection still bound me to them. The official report isn't accurate. Many trauma survivors find it difficult to recall events clearly, she said. Memory can be fragmented, especially after... No, I interrupted. I remember everything perfectly. I just didn't tell the truth about what happened. Christina set down her clipboard. Why don't you tell me now? I opened my mouth, then closed it. How did I even begin? With the clicking sounds on the first night? With Alvin's disappearance? With Grant's confession in the crystal cavern? Something's happening to me, I said instead. Since I got back, things in my apartment move when I'm not looking. I hear sounds, the same sounds I heard on the island before everyone died. Christina's expression remained carefully neutral. What kind of sounds? Clicking, like communication, and sometimes whispers. Do you hear these sounds right now? No, they're mostly at night, in my apartment. She made a note. Have you considered that these might be manifestations of your trauma? The mind often processes traumatic experiences through sensory hallucinations. They're not hallucinations. My voice sounded harder than I intended. I've documented the moving objects with photos, before and after. May I see these photos? I pulled out my phone and showed her the evidence I'd collected, my keys in different locations, books rearranged, furniture slightly repositioned. As she swiped through the images, I watched her face for signs of disbelief or concern. Jaden, she said finally, I want to help you, but I need you to be completely honest with me. What really happened on that island? I stared at the floor, at the neat, geometric pattern of her office carpet. If I told her everything, would she believe me? Or would she decide I was having a psychotic break? My colleagues weren't killed in a geological collapse, I said finally. They were killed by entities, creatures we couldn't see. They tore people apart right in front of me. Christina's expression didn't change, but she made another note. Invisible creatures? Yes. They evolved from organisms that were part of a Cold War bioweapon experiment. The expedition leader, Grant, he was involved in the original project. He brought us there deliberately. And these creatures, you believe they've followed you home. I know how it sounds, I said. But yes, something came back with me. Christina set down her pen. Jaden, what you're describing sounds like a combination of post-traumatic stress and possibly some dissociative symptoms. Your mind may be creating a narrative to help you process the horror of losing your colleagues so suddenly. It's not in my mind, I insisted. The creatures were real. They killed everyone but me and Grant stayed behind to collapse the cavern system with explosives. He sacrificed himself to trap them. Explosives? Christina's eyebrow raised slightly. There was no mention of explosives in the official report. Because I lied in the official report. I couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe me? Christina leaned forward. Jaden, I want to suggest something. What if the geological collapse was so traumatic that your mind created these creatures as a way to make sense of something senseless? Natural disasters don't have motives or intentions, they just happen. But creating an enemy, even an invisible one, gives the tragedy meaning. I shook my head. You don't understand. I saw them in the cavern. They were like jellyfish floating in the air, nearly invisible except when they passed in front of the crystal formations. They communicated with clicks and whispers. Grant confirmed everything. And Grant died in the collapse? Yes, he stayed behind to detonate the charges. So there's no one who can corroborate your experience? I stared at her. You think I'm making this up? I think you experienced something deeply traumatic and your mind is trying to process it. Her voice was gentle. These moving objects, these sounds, they might be manifestations of your unresolved trauma. I'm not crazy, I said. I never suggested you were. Trauma responses aren't insanity, Jaden. They're the mind's attempt to protect itself. I stood up, suddenly needing air. This was a mistake. I shouldn't have come. Jaden, please sit down. We still have time in our session. For what? For you to tell me more about how I'm hallucinating? For us to work together to help you process what happened, whatever the reality of it was. I paced the small office. The reality is that something followed me home from that island. The reality is that I'm not safe, and neither is anyone around me. The reality is that I need to find a way to break this connection before these things do to me what they did to my friends. Christina watched me with concern. What do you mean by break this connection? I stopped pacing. I don't know. That's why I came to you. I thought maybe talking about it would help, but if you don't believe what happened... I believe that you believe it happened, she said carefully, and that's where we start. Please, sit back down. I reluctantly returned to my chair. Jaden, I want to help you, but I can only do that if we're working with the same understanding of reality. Your reality or mine? I asked bitterly. The one that will help you heal. She consulted her notes. You mentioned nightmares. Can you tell me about those? For the remainder of the session, I described my nightmares in detail, the floating predators, the dying screams of my colleagues, Grant's face illuminated by crystal light. Christina listened attentively, asking occasional questions about how the dreams made me feel, what emotions they triggered, how they affected my daily life. By the end of the hour, I felt drained but marginally calmer. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe talking about it would eventually help. Same time next week? She asked as I gathered my things. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. And Jaden? I'd like you to keep a journal of these incidents. The moving objects, the sounds. Note the time, your emotional state, what happened before. It might help us identify patterns. I will, I promised, though I'd already been documenting everything meticulously. I left her office and walked down the hallway toward the elevators, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. As I pressed the down button, I noticed something in my peripheral vision, a faint shimmer in the air beside me, like heat rising from hot pavement. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The shimmer moved, distorting the air in exactly the same way the creatures had on the island just before they attacked.